is how Americans, in a popular way, don't believe in their government anymore. They'll say, you know, I love my country, but I fear my government.
Hello, I'm Hazel Henderson, and this is Worth Quoting. Today I have a very unusual and wonderful guest who is an old friend of mine, William Irwin Thompson, the cultural historian. And I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for us, Bill, to reassess the American dream, the changing American dream. And, you know, I came to this country as an immigrant in the 1960s and from Britain. And the American dream was already very powerful in Europe at that time. And it has been something that's electrified people all over the world looking for that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and all of that. And you are a native-born Irish American. And our two cultures, Ireland and England, have had this tremendously karmic relationship all over the past.
We have to stop meeting like this, dear.
And so you saw it from the point of view of growing up in Los Angeles in the 50s.
Originally Chicago Irish, but I moved when everyone else did in '45 to California.
And so from your perspective, I mean, you were part of the American dream. You came from an Irish family, and you came to be an MIT professor and writing books about cultural history.
Yeah, actually, it's almost classic in the Horatio Alger sense that I was a sort of 9-year-old standing out in the street selling papers and worked my way through, you know, college, and was the first in the family to get an Ivy League PhD and go to Cornell and become an MIT professor and all of that. So it was all the American dream that the working class can make it up and, you know,
yes,
improve themselves.
And certainly when I arrived in New York in the 60s, I was just so dazzled with all of the opportunities. And there was another twist on it for me, and that was even in those days, this society took women much more seriously than I had ever been taken seriously in Britain, for example. Very much more patriarchal kind of culture. So I just felt this tremendous opportunity. You know, I could do anything and be anything. And so as we kind of experienced the 60s and 70s, somehow it was onward and upward. Every generation was going to have a better life than the generation behind them. And then we sort of hit a brick wall in the late 70s, and we ran into all that inflation. And then in the 80s, amazingly enough, we ended up being the world's largest debtor country.
Right.
And somehow what seemed to have happened was that we overshot the mark in terms of consumption. And we had been so told, you know, that consumption is the name of the game, more, bigger houses, better cars, and all of the rest of it. And come on down to Florida and put it on your credit card. And suddenly we realized, my God, you know, we have run up the global credit card now. So here we are in the 90s, and the American dream looks different, doesn't it?
It looks different, and it's sort of losing its dream. I think partly what immigrant society was all about was education, you know, that the people could come to our shores, and then through the public schools they could work their way up and go through City College of New York and end up with a Nobel Prize in medicine or something of this sort. And in my era, the University of California was the largest public education system in the history of the world, and California had the 6th largest, you know, gross national product of any other nation. So there was this tremendous commitment to education, and universities were being built all over the place. And when I got my PhD, I was offered a job at absolutely every single university I applied. Now, no matter how good you are, you know, there'll be, for every opening, there'll be 1,000 applicants, 1,000 PhDs desperate to get the job. So there's been a kind of shift with the new electronic media away from education as the social glue that holds a multicultural, diverse immigrant society together to the state of entertainment, and that people are basically receiving their information in abstract, disembodied forms, whether it's internet or it's World Wide Web or it's television or the rest of it. And with that has come a kind of dumbing down, that there's a lack of emotional commitment to education, and that the idea that everybody can make it up. And so I think this is creating a real crisis, and people are trying to downscale universities, downscale corporations, and keep people happy with kind of just not ideas, but just electronic information.
And isn't it interesting, at the same time, the new waves of immigrants in the U.S. from Asia are just burning up the track.
And they go off the charts in their SAT scores, too.
And they're the ones, you know, that, and of course that is a classic immigrant phenomenon. You know, they are the ones that open the stores and just start the restaurants.
Culture is so important. I know, because I noticed that, too, from being, you talk about being Irish. Well, as an Irish Catholic, moving from Chicago and the kind of Irish ghetto to California, where in Irish Catholic culture, you work hard and you'll get a holy card and you'll become the land of saints and scholars, and if you read a lot, you can be a scholar and it's valued. In other cultures, if you excel, it's considered an insult to the group. And so you'll want to maintain the integrity of the group. And so when different kinds of Catholic cultures, whether they're, you know, Latin or Irish, come together, they collide, you know. And when I was just a kid in Catholic schools in California, the difference between the commitment to intellectuality was just vastly different. I could not go out in the playground because my scores and tests were so high that they were actually trying to kill me. So it was a very different world from going from Chicago to L.A.
And so that glue that held us all together, this whole idea of the American dream, attainable through education and hard work and all of the rest of it, and how that is fragmenting now in the 90s, where there are whole groups of people, you know, kind of really left behind, and the ticket, sometimes the ticket isn't even education. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now, as you know, if you retrain, you're going to have 7 jobs, different careers in your life because of the changing technology. But if you keep on retraining, you know, blah, blah, blah. But then the companies are all downsizing, and they're now in a global economy.
That's right.
And so, so however hard you train, there may not be a job for you anyway. I mean, this is happening, as you know, all over Europe.
Right.
Where,
well, I think if you look at it historically, like we say 1789 to 1989, there was this vast expanding middle class. And it created, you know, everything from track houses to cities and the rest of it. And that period now seems to really have ended. And we seem to be in the turn of the spiral back into a kind of remedievalization where top and bottom are getting very energized. And the lower middle class that in my era made it into the tract houses of the California suburbs, shopping malls, everybody had a track house and a 2-car garage. That seems to be ending, and the lower middle class is getting like pushed down into a working class again, where at the same time fabulous amounts of wealth are being generated at the top. So we're in this remedievalization. It means that the missing middle has to be reinvented. And in the Middle Ages, it was religion. So it does seem to be, in America's fascination with religion, that the future is sort of like a cross between a mutual fund and a religious order. Because the state's not going to take care of people.
No,
and the corporation's not going to paternalistically take care of them with lifetime employment.
Yes.
So who is going to pick up the slack?
Exactly. And of course, you've got that global casino out there where the money and the investments are so fungible now that the very, very rich can invest anywhere in the world. So we still have laws on the books, on the tax code that say that you get investment tax credit if you invest. But because the assumption was that that was going to create jobs, that was going to put a factory up and create jobs for Americans. But of course now you could just as easily be investing that money in an offshore fund that's putting up a factory in Taiwan or India or somewhere else, and there's no guarantee at all that those investment tax credits are going to create jobs in the USA.
You know, and you use the phrase American dream, which really basically means the belief system. And what fascinates me is how Americans, in a popular way, don't believe in their government anymore. They'll say, I love my country, but I fear my government. And you have this whole new phenomenon. And very much the average, Joe Sixpack on the street feels that government is suspicious, and the businessman feels that government intrusiveness is bad. And we rewrite our history. But from another point of view, we can say what made America great is corporations can't take the risk to create space shuttles. They don't know that there's a market out there. First there were the railroads, then there was the Land Grant Act, then there was the GI Bill. I mean, the world that I grew up in as a kind of immigrant going from Chicago to LA, that was created by the GI Bill. It created tract houses, which created shopping centers, which gave us a Visa card to enable credit to be given to the middle class so they could actually buy and shop in those shopping malls. Yeah. All of that's government intrusion into the private sector.
Well, and that's the old language. I think what's happening is we're beginning to reconceive of that, and we're beginning to realize that you can't have a private sector in a complex technological society without a public sector.
Of course,
in other words, you
like
have to.
Ocean together.
I mean, what group of private companies, however large, is going to build a new port? Is going to create a University of California
and the highway system that created the car industry was created by the National Defense Act.
And of course, if you look at the biotechnology industry, that was all investments of the public sector. That was taxpayer-supported scholarship,
And NITI in Japan.
Of course, absolutely. And so I think that we're getting a more balanced conversation about this. And, the old economic textbooks...
But don't you find the libertarian rhetoric much stronger in just the conversations now than it was, say, in the 70s or 80s?
Yes, it's kind of, it's the last sort of, we're not quite sure what kind of a new system we're in, but we do have these textbooks that told us that it was this. And so we can hang on to that. And the market, which is a very important, I mean, to me, there's two very important ways that individuals connect to decision-making at the social level in a complex society. And one is votes. And of course, that's why democracies are spreading all over the place. And the other is markets, prices. But the prices have to be correct. They have to include all the social and environmental costs. And the votes cannot be corrupted by money and big PAC funds. And so that's why people are mystified about how the market works, because they forget that it's underpinned by all of this government investment, in building the highway system and all of that. And they're also mystified about how the government got hijacked by all these big corporations. And so, you were talking about the distrust of the American government. I mean, surveys that were done in the mid-1990s were showing, that 70% of the American people don't trust the government in Washington. And the reason is very clear. They are afraid that those politicians go to Washington and serve the big boys. And the big special interests in the PAC money.
Well, the problem with vote is it's like sort of the public has been manipulated by a convergence of the entertainment industry and sports and celebrityhood, that the politician now is just a form of celebrity. And so you end up in the state of entertainment with this kind of media personalities who, are just simply going where the pool of capital will allow them to maintain their celebrityhood. And that's clearly crashing, because it's kind of interesting, that sometimes politicians will have a pool of $25 million and still not you know, be able to make it. And people are beginning to see in this plutocracy that something has to be done to reinvent democracy, that this plutocracy thing is getting ridiculous.
And, you know, all of the amount of money in American elections, I mean, is very different. We're the only democracy I know of in the world where politicians have to buy time on the mass media. Yeah, and of course, that's why they have to raise all of this money. Whereas, as you know, in all the democracies in Europe and in Canada, the airwaves belong to the people. I mean, they're a public asset. And so politicians have apportioned time to present their case, just the way we did in this country up until the end of the 1970s.
Well, I think there's always a reaction. Now, we need to remember in history that when medieval Christianity got too baroque with selling indulgences, and it was kind of like the NFL of its time. There was this whole elaborate theatrical entertainment industry called religion, and the Reformation just came in just reaction to it and said, back to simplistics, and let's get away with all this stuff. And now that our politics is just like a presidential election is a permanent Super Bowl, and it just, every year it goes on and on and on, and there is no difference between the NFL and the Democrat and Republican. Well, I think people are getting disgusted with it.
Because, you know, I used to call them the Republicrats, you know, the two parties like two football teams owned by the same owners. Right. And, you know, now, I mean, it's almost got to the point where I call them the pork party and the bacon party. Yeah. And it's all about what we can get, you know, in this money game. And so I think what the American people are so fed up with is this polarization of every me good, you bad, our program right, your program wrong.
Attack ads on TV instead of issues and ideas.
Yeah, and this whole disgusting crossfire format, you know, where everybody's shouting at each other and there's all this heat and no light. And so one of the things I'd like to ask you about, I think there absolutely does have to be a third party in the U.S. just to triangulate these issues, you know, and yet there's a lot of third-party activity, you know, that's come up in the mid-1990s, but it's very much easier to diagnose the problem than it is to prescribe. Right. Most of the prescriptions are a rear-view mirror, balance the budget. Well, yes, that's important, but you could put the country into a recession.
It does seem like we're moving toward an ecology of maybe more than, you know, just 3 or 4, and the Democrats and Republicans are still trying to say, well, we can have this wing within the Republican, but it always has to be pulled toward the center because America tends to be a centrist kind of country, and that holds it together more than, you know, multi-party places like Israel where they fracture up into tiny parties and it's hard to create a constituency to run. We tend to like Avis and Hertz, Pepsi and Coke, Burger King and McDonald's, and so Republican and Democrat sort of feeds in. But it generates this kind of sameness where there's no difference between the Miami Dolphins and the Dallas Cowboys. It's just the same old stuff. And I think that's not going to work anymore.
And, you know, the sort of thing you're finding now is that both of the old parties, these wings are diverging. I mean, you know, you have within the Republican Party, you've got an isolationist wing and an internationalist wing. Right. And they've got the same thing within the Democratic Party. And then you've got the Perot forces, you know, that were almost 20% of the vote, and they are just mad as hell.
Well, the failure of the Greens in Germany, and you, of course, were, you know, you knew Petra Kelly and many of the people involved with that, but they tended to become so sanctimonious and so pious that they alienated a lot of the kind of electorate in Germany and Switzerland. And so the dynamic by which a new party comes in seems to me critical, and a lot of the issues sometimes cut across radical right and radical left. There may be a kind of bioregionalism that is something that isn't Republican Democrat, but actually unites left and right. And so some of the old the old geometries don't work for a complex dynamical system.
Now, I can give you an example of that I've been involved in over the past few years, and that is changing from the political debate around the GNP, and whether the gross national product was going up, and you know, and if the gross national product's going up, the stock market's going up, you should feel okay. And this was what, back in 1994, President Clinton was so upset about, because, you know, the GNP was going up, the stock market was going up, all the numbers were right, and yet he didn't he lost, you know, the Congress. And what American people are trying to have, I think, is a debate about quality of life.
Right.
And so, as you know, one of the things I've done over the years is put out a new kind of quality of life index, which really allows people to unpack that mysterious number, you know, a GNP, and say, well, let's look at what this is really about. You know, it's not just whether the numbers went up on the money side, but did the schools get better?
Yeah.
Did the streets get safer? Did the air get dirtier or cleaner? And so I think that that's really a lot of this back to the community.
Well, one of the big changes there is it's you have a kind of system of ideas that are part of a form of belief and values, whereas in kind of media society where people are being microwaved with just issues, you know, pro-life, pro-choice, and they're not part of a larger kind of configuration, then they're not allowed to really think things through and have a coherent sort of philosophy of life. But whereas yours is part of a whole configuration. It relates to gender issues, it relates to ecology, it relates to civility. It's really a transformation of culture. And it's not just a target issue. Are you for this or are you against that?
Yes, people are so tired of that. And none of this maps onto their experience. I mean, they're trying to say, well, here I am, and I live in this town, and my life is much more hurried than it ever was, and, you know, I'm holding down 2 jobs, you know, that the American dream now requires 2 paychecks instead of 1, and, you know, what is the quality of my life, and why am I spending more and more of the precious hours of my life earning, inflating money, currency, and on this rat race. And so it really is a huge, as you would say, a sort of phase shift, and we haven't got the language for what this new American dream should be. But, you know, let's think in this last few minutes that we have is, you know, what is the most positive aspect of the American dream? How can we retain that and throw away some of the baggage, you know, that it really wasn't
I think it's very much
about
the
more and
commitment
bigger
to the
cars,
individual,
and,
you know, and before the serfs in Russia would be bound to the soil, and you had various forms of rigid class societies that were structured in England or Ireland, and that people had no expressive space with which to, you know, have their own story of their movement. We tended to always treat it capitalistically, from rags to riches, the Horatio Alger form. And now, because we're in such a informationally saturated solution, I think people are beginning to realize that ideas and visions and value and consciousness is actually the new neighborhood, and it's not objects. And those who try to define themselves between, well, I have a Rolex watch and a Rolls Royce or a BMW and a big house, that world is definitely crashing.
Yes,
and those who float like corks on seas can survive storms that sink battleships. And
you know, and another
is where it's, you know, most critical.
Yeah, and this deepening of our thinking about what is the American dream and what do we take into the next millennium with us, I'm very fascinated by this this sense that people have of, you know, of being kinder. I mean, you know, George Bush talked about a kinder, gentler nation, but there is a whole idea where even bestsellers, you know, have titles now like Your Money or Your Life.
Right.
And people are really getting deeper with the idea of why do I need to buy all of the stuff that's not really to do with the good life.
And most of the bestsellers really are how to fix your life kind of things. They're sort of Celestine prophecies or Deepak Chopra's 20 Secrets to a Spiritual Life or whatever. And so I think people have a hunger that once they have all these things, it's still not working, either the relationship with wives or children or whatever, spice. So the new qualities of medicine that is just basically health and not just drugs, that gives, again, an emphasis on the individual can actually be in charge of, you know, his or her own life. And so that's very much in the American dream, not so much the collectivity that it's the individual.
The other part of the individual of the American dream, the individualism thing, which I think is coming on very strong now, is responsibility. That it was all about, I want mine, more and more goods and services. I have my rights, the individual, and now there is a balancing of that with responsibility, and you know, the responsibility of what I make of my life and my neighborhood and my relationships.
Of communities that work, because if you have a polarized city where you have, you know, Beverly Hills at one end and South Central LA going up in flames at the other, clearly that isn't viable. And so places of civility of, you know, Toronto or Cincinnati's, these other kind of cities that seem to be working and that actually still have recycling in neighborhoods and local government, those are beginning to really magnetize people's attention. As the consumer, the American dream was LA, and I grew up there, and it was the swimming pool in the backyard, the 2 or 3 cars in the garage, and LA that vision is in deep trouble.
In deep trouble. And you know, it's funny because the new sense of community and responsibility for relationships and making the community work, here in this city, in Jacksonville, Florida, there is a really important social experiment which is traveling around the world, and that is the Jacksonville Quality Indicators for Progress.
I wonder where that came from.
And well, I found this model. They've been doing it in this city since 1983, and it brings the community together, and they have all of these different indicators of quality of life in Jacksonville. What do we want? The quality of life in not only the air and the water, but race relations and community and transportation and of course jobs. And in a sense, this is a sort of precursor, I think, of redefining the American dream in the next millennium. Thank you very much for being with us, Bill.
Thank you, Hazel.
Until next time, I'm Hazel Henderson.